Okay, so let's see where we should start from. Yesterday, the last raya we brought was from the Kohen HaMashiach, who, although for most korban is chatos, he brings a different type of korban than a regular citizen. He brings a male instead of a female, and he needs to have helam dover, not just shikugas maisa. But there was a machloikis if, when it comes to avodah zarah, if even shikugas maisa would be mechayev a kohen HaMashiach with a korban, and everybody agrees that it was the same type of korban. So the Gemara was probing what is shikugas maisa. So the Gemara thought maybe shikugas maisa means me'avu me'ira, which would indicate that avo and yira would be chayiv, which would be a raya to, Abaye. So the Gemara said no. Maybe what shikugas maisa is that you don't know, the Kohen didn't know about the Isser of Avodah Zarah, and maybe Helam Davar is Kiyum Miktsas, Ubital Miktsas, meaning he didn't know that a Shtachavaya was also. Again, surprising that a Kohen HaMashiach wouldn't know this, but I guess in the second base of Mikdash, the selection was not based on their knowledge. Zok the Heilige Mishnah. Tani Zok the Heilige Gemara, which is on Samach Beis Amud Aleph, 5 lines on the top. Tani Reb Zakkai Kamed Reb Yochanan. Reb Zakkai quoted a brisa in front of Reb Yochanan. This is what he quoted: Zivach v'kiter v'nisach v'ishtachava. So these are the 4 avodas that are listed off in our Mishnah as universal avodas, that even though this is not the kedarka of the avodah zarah that you're serving, nevertheless, these have a chiyuv misa. But all 4 avodas were done behelam echad, meaning he didn't realize that it was aser. So the question is, how many karbanos of chatos does he have to bring? Zokt Rabbi Yochanan. And so Zokt Reb Zakkai. Reb Zakkai quoted in front of Rabbi Yochanan, Einoi chayiv ela achas. He's only going to be chayiv one. As Rashi says, Einoi chayiv elachas v'chol avodos of avodah ba'asar achasem lois avdei. Since there's no special lav for each individual type of way to serve in avodah zarah, there's one lav of lois avdei. Therefore, hilchach ein kan chilik chatois. If you did all 4 will violate the same, violated the same lav, and therefore there's only one chiyuv chatos. Rabbi Yochanan did not like Rabbi Zakkai's brisa at all. Amalei poik tani levra. Get this guy out of here. What he's saying is simply not true. The tosu, it's a mistake. Ulakamon the Farish time when the Gemara is going to now elaborate as to why Rabbi Yochanan said that this was a mistake. Amar Rab Abba, Zok Rab Abba, Hod Amar Rab Zakkai, Machloikis Rab Yosy v'Rab Nosan. Rab Zakkai said that there is a machloikis between Rab Yosy and Rab Nosan. And what is the machloikis? The machloikis is by Havara. The Torah included all of the malachas of Shabbos in one lav, but the Torah then specified a special lav for Havara. The question is, for what reason did the Torah itemize only one lav, the lav of Havara, when all of the malachas are asuras? There's a very famous machlokes between Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Nosan about it. The Tanya, Havara lelav yotza. Do you know why the Torah said by Havara l'savaru? To tell you that although all the other malachas, if you do them, you're chayiv misa. Havara is different. Havara, you're only over a lav, you're not going to be chayiv misa. Div Rabbi Yosy, Rabbi Nosan Amar lechalach yotza. To tell you that even though there's one general lav for all of these Surah Shabbos, since the Torah specified a specific lav for the lav of Lo Yisavayu, it tells me that Lo Yisavayu has its own lav. So it goes back to the rule we had a couple of days ago, that Kol Davar Sheyotzim Nachlal, it didn't just go out of the klal for itself, Ela L'lamed Ala Klal Kula Yotza, to tell you that all of the Malachai Shabbos, if one is over them all, Behelamachas, he has to bring a separate chatos for each one. Let's see Rashi. Havara. Sheyotzos Mechlal Loisasa kol malacha de Shabbos. It was taken out of the general rule of lo yisasar kol malacha, which encompasses any type of malacha, and the Torah specified lo yisivaru eish b'chol mosh v'secha. So one mandamar holds the lav yotza, which is Rabbi Yosy, and that is loitzia mechumer shar malachos. You know why the Torah specified lo yisivaru eish? To tell you that it's not as chomer as all the other malachos. Ulalami doleh she'ena loy b'kares v'loy b'misa ela b'lav. There's no kares for it. There's no misa for it. With the adam, it's just a lav. While Reb Nosson said lechalik yotzes, for Keret he learned great chomer from it. Lechalik v'loymar loch, to teach you mazu muyuchedes. Just like the Isra of Havara is unique. Shehi me'avos malachos anasos b'mishkan. It's one of the avos malachos that are done in the Mishkan. V'chayev aleh kosov b'fnei atzmai, and therefore the Torah gave it its own independent lav. Sheparat la levada, because the Torah specified it individually. Av kol shu av malacha. So to all of the other avos malachos. Im oson behelam echad, if you did them all in one haze of not knowing that they were osir, or not knowing that it was Shabbos, or not knowing that there's an Isra Shabbos, chayiv al kol achas v'achas. You're chayiv for each one, because just like Havara is unique and special, an individual, so too are all the rest of the malachos. And this is based on what we say in Karbonos. At the end of Karbonos, we say the Brayz of Bishmol, the Chol Dover Shoy Bechlal, the Yotzim Nachlal Lamed, and it went out of the cloud to teach us something. Loy Lamed Al Atzma Yotza. It's not just teaching us a chiddush about it itself. El Lamed Al Klal Kula Yotza. It's actually telling us an important halacha relevant to the rest of the klal, and in this case it's Lachalak Yotza. If multiple malachas are done b'Helam Echad, multiple karbonos have to be brought. So Zok Gemara, L'man D'Amar Havara L'Lav Yotza. If you hold Havara L'Lav Yotza, meaning whenever you have a general Isser, like Hamalacha Lo Yisasu, and then you have a specific Isser, Lo Shavaru Eish, it tells you L'Chalak Yotzes. Well, we have exactly the same scenario by Avodah Zarah. We have Loisa Avdim, which is the general lav for all type of Avodah Zarahs. And then we have Zovech Lahim Yochram, or we have Loisa Shtachav Elahim. So it's exactly the same setup as that setup as found in Shabbos. So Zog to Gemara, L'man D'Omar, L'Lav Yotzes, Hishtachava, let me look at the Aleph, Nami L'Chalak Yotza. So if you hold L'Chalak Yotza, well then why don't you say the same thing for Hishtachava? And if you would say the same thing for Hishtachava, then what happens? Then if someone did Zivach, Kiter, Nisach, and Hishtachava B'Helam Echad, you should be chayiv multiple karbonos, just like the lav of Havor tells you L'Chalak Yotzes. So that's why Rabbi Yochanan rejected the brayso that Rabbi Zakkai presented to him, who said that Ein Chayiv Alachas, because based on Rabbi Nosson, who says L'Chalak, this should be L'Chalak Yotzes as well. Okay, let's have a look. Let's have a look at Rashi. Because you see there's a little bit of a question if it's L'Chalak Yotzes or L'Lav Yotzes. Zokt Rashi, L'Kamon Omar, later on, the Gemara is going to tell us tomorrow, 3 times it says Lo Yisavdim, and we apply them to different things. Achas L'Shaloi Kedarka, L'Chidamar L'Il. One is to tell you that if you do an avodah that's Shaloi Kedarka, but it's an honorable malacha, such as Hishtachava, that will be a chiv misa. Asar minayin, where do we know it from? Talmud Leimer Lo Hishtachava. V'yachas l'chedarka, the other of them is to tell you, don't serve an avodah zara the way it's prescribed. V'yachas l'chalik, and the third one would be l'chalik. Ma hishtachava miyuchedes, ma yisala atzmai, v'chayiv alo ba'atzmai. Just like Hishtachava, in and of itself, would create a Chiyav Misa of Avodah Zarah. Av kol avodah v'avodah b'shoigeg chayav aleh chatas latzma. So too, if multiple avodas were done, b'helam echad, each one would trigger its own independent Chiyav chatas. V'tanad Reb Zakkai svir leik Reb Yosy. The Tanad Reb Zakkai, who held it was all one big lav, Matal like Rabbi Yosy, the hu ishtachavo yisera lav l'chalak yotza, ela l'lamed aleh ashi b'lav v'loy b'kares. In other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is the same achloikis that they have, l'gabi the surim of Shabbos, should apply to avodah zarah as well, because it's exactly the same arrangement and the same structure. So if you hold l'chalak yotzes, then you would learn. So if you hold l'chalak yotzes by Shabbos, you would learn the same thing by avodah zarah. That for each individual avodah, there should be an individual chiyuv carbon, which contradicts the brisa that Rab Abba quoted. And if you hold l'chalak, if you hold l'lav yotzes, well, then you would learn by hishtachava that hishtachava doesn't get chorus. It's only a lav. She b'lav ve'ein chat shal shilgosa. Now, this would be a little bit different than havara, because havara, we said, is a regular lav. Even if you did it measured with edim and asra, you wouldn't get misa. But you cannot say that by hishtachava. So by hishtachava, you'll say v'afal pi shechayavnu la misa da gabi skiluksiv v'ishtachavu lahem. It says you get skila for it. That's if there's edim and asra. But what if there is no asra or no edim? So there's no chorus. Miu mi kares umi chatos afka, and therefore, if it was not done b'mezid with edim and asra, there would be no chiyuv chatos. Hilchach lemishkaches kra ba'avodas kachal l'chalit. According to the shita of Rab Yosy, who holds l'lav yotzos, that's how he would learn hishtachava by avodas zarah as well. So basically, the same machlokes that Rab Yosy and Rab Nosson have in reference to Shabbos, they're going to have in reference to avodas zarah. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan rejected what Rab Zakkai said, because Rabbi Yochanan must hold that we paskin that havora l'chalak yotzes, and therefore each act of avodah zarah should trigger its own chiyuv chatas. Gewalt maske for Rabbi Yosef. Frag Rabbi Yosef the gewalt al kasha. Yes, there's a machlokes by Shabbos, but the machlokes by Shabbos is what we build out from the fact that havara was specified as a standalone lav. But we don't necessarily know that there's actually a machlokes lahalacha. Maybe they all agree that l'chalak yotzes, every single malacha triggers its own chiyuv. It's just that Rabbi Yosy told you don't learn that out of the fact that havara was listed. You learn it out of a different place. And if that's the case, then it for sure should apply here as well. So maskeful Rabbi Yosef. Dilmat kan come Rabbi Yosy hasam havara l'lav yotza. Why did Rabbi Yosy say there havara l'lav yotza? Because he already knows chiluk malachos. The nafkale chiluk malachos me'achas mehena. And we're going to soon see what that drasha is. Now, me'achas mehena is a pasuk that talks about any time you bring a korban chatos, it's if someone was over me'achas mehena from one of these listed aveiros that are mechayiv yukoros. So let's see the pasuk. Daber el bnei Yisrael lemar nevesh kisechta b'shkaga. So this introduces the parish of korban chatos. Mikol mitzvahs Hashem asher lo yisayasena v'asa me'achas mehena. And we learn from there that every lav, every different malacha would have its own chiyuv chatas. So maybe Rabbi Yosy doesn't agree. Rabbi Yosy doesn't argue with Nosson about the halacha l'maisa that you bring a korban for each avera. He's just discussing what you learn specifically from havara, and he learns from havara. You learn that it's l'lav yotzes, but that doesn't mean he disagrees with Rab Nosson, who holds that you have to bring multiples. So now we have both mandamim, Sa'ir Rab Nosson should agree that by avodah zarah there should be multiple chatos. Now let's see how we dash in this me'achas mehena. It's a fascinating drush. The Tanya Rabbi Yosy Emer. It says in the pasuk v'asa me'achas mehena, and Rashi tells us it should have said v'asa achas. You did one of the aveiros, or v'asa achas hena. Why did it have a mem me'achas and a mem me'hena? We could have gotten away just with the word achas. So the Gemara is going to say we have four different things that we could learn out of it. So let's look at Rashi on the very first wide line. Me'achas mehena, gabechatas ksiv. That's the word that the Torah uses when it's introducing the concept of a korban chatas. And we learn from here that Sometimes, even if there's multiple chiyuvim, you'll only bring one carbon chatos. And what would be the example of that? So what if someone did multiple malachas on Shabbos? But it's not because he didn't know that each of these malachas were also on Shabbos. He didn't know that it was Shabbos. So the mistake is all one common mistake. There, you're only going to bring one carbon chatos. But what if he brings one chatos because he didn't know it was Shabbos, but he knew every single malacha that he did, he knew it was also on Shabbos. He just didn't realize that it was Shabbos today. So such a shoygeg may be carbon echad. The chadash kagahui. It's one mistake. He didn't know that today was Shabbos. But upa'amim, sometimes shechayiv al kol echad va'echad. Sometimes you'll be chayiv individual karbanos for every malacha. Kigoyin shehezid b'Shabbos. He knew it was Shabbos today. V'yaydeya shu Shabbos hayoyim. V'yay Shabbos b'Torah. He knew there's such a thing as Shabbos. But why did he do this averis? Unknowingly, because v'shagig b'malachos. Shalahoy yaydeya shamalachas alalu asurais. He thought that other malachas are also on Shabbos, not these malachas. So every single malacha that he did was a separate mistake. He didn't know that Zareya was also, he didn't know that Koitcha was also, but Avadi knew Shabbos was also. So since his mistakes are multiple mistakes, then Chayiv al kol achas va'achas, so yesh kagazarbe. Now he's got to bring multiple karbonis because he's made multiple mistakes. So Rabbi Yosy in the Farnish time, Rabbi Yosy Hechem Ashmali, Hi Mehekra. Yosy explains how did Rabbi Yosy learn from Me'achas Mehena this theme that you do bring individual chatois for each shagig. So the pasuk says va'asa me'achas mehena. Zokt Rashi havalei lemichtav either va'asa achas mehena, you did one of these averes. Inami va'asa mehena, you did from these averes. Inami va'asa achas v'lishtoik. Midichsivenu hachi me'achas mehena. There's a lot of drushes here available. Shemami na lemidrash kol chad v'chad l'chuda. We're going to darshan the me'achas, the mehena, the me'achas, and the combination of me'achas mehena. L'chayvoy al achas, there'll be a chiyuv for achas, v'al me'achas, and there'll also be a chiyuv on me'achas. What does that mean? Kloimer mikdas avera. So if you did achas, you did an avera, you chayav achatas. What if you did me'achas? You only did part of an avera. You'll be chayav achatas there as well. And we're going to have examples for what these cases are referring to. The same thing, Heina, al Heina, val Mehena. Could mafarish that Heina is avois and Mehena are toldos. Ulamidishinu nami ki adadi hachi midisamchi adadi. We're also going to learn the interrelationship between Me'achas and Mehena because they're also both there together. So now let's see the details. V'amar Rabbi Yosy and my Talmid Rabbi Yosy dichsiv also Me'achas Mehena achas Me'achas. That's one drasha. Heina Mehena. And then there's achas she'heina, and then there's heina she'achas. So let's see what these cases represent. Achas would be Shimon. If you write the name Shimon, you're over the Isser Derais of Kaisef. Me'achas, if you only did part of an Isser, you'll still be chayav achatos. Shame mi Shimon. You were planning to write the name Shimon, but you stopped after the second letter. But the second letter is the mem, so Shin, mem, Shem, it's also a name. So you were also chayiv, even though you didn't write the intended name, but you wrote a name. That would also be mechayiv you achatos. Then there's heinas avos, meheina are toldos. That you learn in Hilchos Shabbos. We know there's avos, melachos, and toldos. Then we're going to learn the interconnection between achas and heina. Achas shehi heina. What do you mean achas? One aver that's multiple averes. That zadon Shabbos v'shigras melachos. That's what Rashi introduced us earlier. That you didn't know it was, you knew it was Shabbos, and you know it's also to do malach on Shabbos, but you didn't know about each individual malacha that you did, that these were malachas that were forbidden. So therefore, it's achas shohena. It's one issue of Shabbos, but there's multiple chatois because you made multiple mistakes. And then you have heina shiachas, is the same thing. You did multiple averis, multiple malachas, but you knew that all of these malachas were usher, but you had one big mistake. You didn't know that today was Shabbos. That would be shigul Shabbos v'zad malachas. So here we have by Me'achas Mehena we have a general klal that tells us across the board, in fact, that you do bring multiple chatois. Aval hacha the loinavka lechilik melachos miduch tachriti. But in our sugya of avodah zarah, where you don't have any other place to learn chilik melachos from, maybe the chula alma hishtachava lechalak yatsa. Maybe everybody would agree that hishtachava is lechalak yatsa. So the argument is, Reb Zaka, you brought a brisa to say that you only bring one chatas for multiple averos of avodah zarah. Fakert. Maybe everybody agrees that over here by avodah zarah you say lechalak yatsa, and it's even more because never mind. You can learn it out of Ishtachava. For the Gemara, Chilik Malachas, the Avodah Tzedakavim, Nami Tepekle Me'achas Mehena, because Me'achas Mehena it applies to all Chayvei Krisos. So the same way we split it up into these four categories by Shabbos, we have those same four categories by Avodah Zarah, and therefore, once again, everybody should unanimously hold that there's multiple chatois. So Reb Zakai's brisa that he presented to Rabbi Yochanan was rejected because of that. Achas zvicha. So achas would refer to a complete shechting. Me'achas by avodah zarah would be siman echad, where you only shechted one siman, such as of a bird, which is a kosher shechita. I believe that's what Rashi says. Rashi says achas. Over here. So lav dafka in a bird is where you find it. That's a shchita. But if you did that, even if you shechted one simon in an animal, that might also be avodah zarah. Okay, heina is avos. What are the avos? Zibuach, kiter, nisuch, vishtachava. Mehena are toldois. What are toldois? Shiber makol lefanah. This is a very fascinating one. Breaking a stick in front of an avodah zarah would be a toldo of zivuach. What does that have to do with anything? So let's look at Rashi, how he explains what breaking this stick means. Shiber makol lefanah. L'shem avodas kachavim. You broke a stick. That's the avodah zarah that you're doing. The serving is by breaking a stick. The dami l'shchita, breaking a stick, is similar to shchita. That's why we call it a tolda of shchita. Sheshever mafrakta, where you're breaking the animal's neck. Uchegoyin the darka la'oivda b'makal. Of course, the only time breaking a stick in front of an avodah zarah would be considered avodah zarah is if that was the kedarka. Kidarminu b'mesechas avodah kechavim b'perek b'shmuel avodah kechavim she'oivdin oisa b'makal. What type of avodah zarah do you serve with a stick? Shiber makal lefaneh chayiv. If you broke a stick in front of it, you're chayiv. So maybe that's what the mei achas is referring to by avodah zarah. And then you have heina is avos. Zivuach kiter v'shachava main is told us was shiber makal lefaneh, and achashi heina would be Zadon avodas kechavim v'shigagas avodas. Achash that's multiple would be that you knew avodah zarah is aser, but you didn't know that each of these individual malachas were aser. There you would bring multiple karbanos, one for each mistake that you made in thinking that each of these avodas were mutter. And heneshi achas would be shigagas avodas kechavim v'zadon avodas. You knew the avodas might have been aser, but you didn't know b'chalal there's such a din of avodah zarah. Now that you cannot say that. That doesn't make sense. How could you say you knew these avodas were aser, but you didn't know avodah zarah is aser? If you didn't know avodah zarah is aser, all avodas are mutter. So the Gemara is going to deal with that in a second. Zog to Gemara. At the end of the day, so far we're showing that everybody should agree that you'll bring a separate carbon individually for each aver. So Zog to Gemara. Heina shiachas. What's heina shiachas? Shigagas avodas kechavim v'zadin avodas. Frank the Gemara, hi shigagas avodas kechavim hechadam. What does it mean he was a shoyig he didn't know that avodah zarah is also. If the case is where he bowed down to a building thinking that it was a basic knesses, but it wasn't, so that's a great example where he knows bowing down to an avodah zarah is also, but he thought that when he was bowing down to this building, he didn't know that it was an avodah zarah. He thought that in fact it was a besmedrash. So that's not avodah zarah at all. That's not a shogig. Hare libay l'shemayim, like we learned yesterday. That's not avodah zarah at all. Elo the chaza adarta v'sogadlei. Adarta was kings make statues of themselves all over, and some of them are worshipped as gods. And he saw such a statue. He bowed down to it out of respect for the king, not as an avodah zarah. But it turned out that this particular one was an idol. Zok Gemara, it's still not considered avodah zarah because ikibli alei mezeru. If when he bowed down, he had in mind that yes, he was accepting this as a deity. Yes, that's amazing. But he loy kablei like klumu, so it's not a shaykh. So what is the case of the Zadan Avodah Kachavim, but Vishigas? I'm saying the Zadan Avodah Vishigas Avodah Kachav. Ella, you know what it must be referring to? It must be a case of Me'ava Umayira. So we went through this whole diversion, this whole brisa, because it all comes back to the question that Abai and Rava have. If you do Avodah Zarah Me'ava Umayira, are you chayiv or not? Here it says Me'ava Umayira, you would be chayiv a korban. No, that's a right to Abaye. Hanichel Abaye the Amar Chayiv, Ela Rava the Amar Potter. According to Rava, Me'ava Umayira is Potter. Ma'ikal Meimar, what would be an example to satisfy the Bryce's halacha of Shigugas Avodas Kachavim and Zadan Avodas? Where do you have such a thing? Or you didn't know that it's a Shogig and Hol Avodah Zarah, but you knew about the Avodas. How is that possible? Ella, you know what it must be? But Omer Mutter. It must be a case of Omer Mutter. Now, Omer Mutter means he's saying that it's mutter to do Avodah Zarah. Now, if that's the case, it's a little bit difficult. Because look at Rashi. Ella Omer Mutter, Kisover Ein Avodas Kachavim Matera. The Shogig of Avodas Kachavim was, he didn't know that Avodah Zarah is Aser. Frag the Gemara, frag Rashi, now that's not a case of Shigugas Avodah Zarah, but Zadoin Avodos. Because if you don't know that there's anything things Avodah Zarah, then obviously you're also a shogig for all of the avodas, because there is no such thing as avodah zarah, and that's what Rashi points out. When he the loyav shiggas avodas kachavim v'zaden avodos elashiggas zevize, because if you don't know there's bechlal and this avodah zarah, of course you don't know about any avodas, because there is no iser. Nevertheless, miyu krod the kamar heina sheyachas v'achimukimla. We'll still say that heina sheyachas in reference to avodah zarah means that he bechlal didn't know that avodah zarah was also. Elbayim mutter. If you're going to say that this brayta is referring to a case of Omer Mutter, and it's saying that Omer Mutter is a shogig that you bring a carbon for, Tivsha, we have to be poshed a shaila that until now the Gemara had a suffix on. The boy minei Rava Meir of Nachman, Helam zeh v'zeh b'yadoi mau. What if I didn't know anything? I didn't know that it was Shabbos. I didn't know that the malachas were also. What would be the halacha? Let's see Rashi. The Rashi doesn't say anything on it. But if you hold Omer Mutter as a shogig, then we know the answer. We know you'd have to bring a carbon for it. So Tivshoit the boy we know Rabbi Marabnach when the Helam Zev Zev Yodim out. Tivshoit Deina Chayv Alachas. You should be able to bring a raya from here, because we're calling it of Heina Achas, meaning it's Heina Sheinachas. Because since I didn't know that Avodah Zarah was Osir, you only bring one carbon. There was a Shaila how many carbon should bring in Shabbos. Bring a raya from here. And you don't see that the Gemara brought a raya from here. So that can't be pshat in the brisa. Zok Mahala Kasha. V'tivshot. Yeah, maybe it is a raya from here. Big deal. Maybe it is a raya from here. The Gemara didn't bring this brisa as a raya. No, but maybe you talk about a raya from here that Omer Mutter, you bring only one carbon. Fragt Gemara, mi motzis, mukmi, lahani kroi, b'avodas kachavim. How could you possibly say that these psukim are in reference to avodas kachavim? The Ilhacha Ksiv b'Mashiach par uvenasi seir. Now, me'achas mehena is the introduction to the Parsha of Chatois. In the introduction to the Parsha of Chatois, the Torah there says, and what is the Chatas? The Chatas is a female animal. If the Chatas is a female animal, then they can't possibly speaking about a par koi Mashiach. Umimatus mukmis lahani kroy b'avodas kachavim diluhachaksiv b'mashiach par. A carbon, a carbon Mashiach. What type of animal does he bring? He brings a par. Uvanasi sir, uvayachet kaspa useira, and the yachet brings a kaspa useira. Ve'ilu ba'avodas kachavim tanan, but by avodas kachavim it says v'shavin she b'seira kayachet. So what is this Gemara's kasha? Zok to Gemara. How could you say that Hachas and Heina is referring to the Avodah Zarah like we just said? The problem is by Avodah Kachavim we learned V'shavin Rabbi V'Chachamim Shekoyin Mashiach V'Sira Kiyachet. So therefore, how could you possibly say that this pasuk is referring to anything else? Because the pasuk clearly is only speaking about a Seira Kiyachet. Zok Gemara v'sulay midi. There's no answer to this kasha. Let's have a look at Rashi. V'sulay midi, leka l'shnuya midi. We're not able to answer this kasha. Hilchach, therefore, loy nafkalon chilik malachos ba'avodas kachavim mehacha. We're not going to be able to learn out chilik malachos of avodah zara from me'achas mehena. Rather, we're going to go back to Rabbi Yosef. Elameh hishtachavo kedakafta to Rabbi Yosef. The only place where we will know that you have to bring a separate carbon for each mice of avodah zarah is from Rabbi Yosef. V'had Rab Zakai the poterlei bechada Rab Zakai. What did we can do with Rab Zakai? The mice Rab Zakai did bring a brisa that quite clearly indicates that even with multiple avodas, there is only one carbon. He's going to have to learn it from a different pasuk. He'll have to say Melissa Avdaim Hakasav also an avodah achas. He'll have to learn it from the extra Lisa Avdaim, and we'll see later. The Gemara says this from the actual Lisa Avdaim. It's teaching us that even though normally you might split up these averis and make them into a chiyah for multiple karbonos, the Torah is telling us by avodah zarah it's different, and that could be pshat in the brayso of Reb Zakai, but Lamaisa Rabbi Yochanan rejected it. Okay, Gavalti. Zok Tele Gemara. He also Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. When Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came, he said that the brayso that Rabbi Yochanan rejected, that Reb Zakai presented, has nothing to do with what we just discussed. It was a completely different brayso. He also Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda Amar. Hachi Tanakamei. This is the brayso that Reb Zakai quoted in front of Rabbi Yochanan, and this is the brayso that Rabbi Yochanan rejected. And the brayso is as follows: Chomer b'Shabbos mishar mitzvahs. Shabbos is more chomer than shar mitzvahs, and we'll have to see what shar mitzvahs are. And chomer b'shar mitzvahs mi b'Shabbos. So in some way, Shabbos is more chomer than the other mitzvahs, and in some way, the other mitzvahs are more chomer than Shabbos. Chomer b'Shabbos. In what way is Shabbos more chomer than other mitzvahs? Shabbos also shtayim b'helam echad chayav al kalachas v'achas. On Shabbos, if you did multiple malachas, not knowing that they were aser, you bring multiple karbonos. Masha'enke b'shar mitzvahs, but by other mitzvahs, you would not bring multiple karbonos. We're going to have to know exactly what the case is. Chomer b'shar mitzvahs, and where do you see that other mitzvahs are more chomer than Shabbos? Sheb'shar mitzvahs shogag beloy mischaven is chayiv. If you're a shogig, but you're ein mischaven, you'll be chayiv. Masha'enke b'Shabbos, by Shabbos, if you're shogig beloy mischaven, you would be potter because maleches machsheves also Torah. Let's see what this means. Rashi elaborates on what this means of shogag beloy mischaven. So Rashi says, "Shebishar mitzvahs shogag beloy mischaven." What's an example? B'chalovin and b'arayis. What if someone was misasik b'chalovin b'arayis? Meaning he thought he was eating saliva. Or by arayis he thought he was being boiled a woman that was mutter to him, and it turned out being usher to him. What would be the case by chelav? It was chelav that was melted, so it looked like liquid. So he didn't even think. He wasn't sure if it wasn't a suffix. Is this chelav that's also a chelav that's mutter? Is it chelav or shuman? Which means he recognized that it was chelav. He just didn't know if it was mutter or usher. No, he didn't even recognize that this was chelav. It was a liquid. And he swallowed it. The loy meschaven lachila. He wasn't even being mechaven to eat. He wasn't trying to eat at all. Ella misasik b'davar achar b'belias roik. He thought he was just swallowing his saliva, and he didn't realize that there was actually dissolved chaylev in his mouth. So that's called misasik, because he wasn't even trying to eat anything, yet he ended up eating chaylev. V'hechidami shoygig gomer. What's a real shoygig? That's mischaven. That's kesavar shumanu. There's a piece of meat here, and he ate it knowingly, but he thought that it was meat that was mutter when it was really aser. So there, his intent was to eat a piece of meat, thinking that the piece of meat was mutter. Here, he wasn't even trying to eat a piece of meat. He thought it was his own saliva. So he wasn't even trying to eat anything. Nevertheless, this is not Shabbos, this is Chaylev. Why is he chayiv for such a shoygig? With the enemies chaven and ganzen? Because Lamaisa, he had enough from what he swallowed. By Shabbos, in such a case, if he wasn't mischaven to the moloch at all, he would not be chayiv. Ma'asheke b'Shabbos, kagoy nischaven lagbias atolish. He thought that there was a bundle on the ground that was completely cut from the ground, so he's allowed to lift it up. But it turned out when he yanked it, turned out that it was actually still connected to the ground, and unknowingly he ripped it out of the ground. There it's potter, because he didn't even have any intention whatsoever to cut anything. He just wanted to pick something up. That's an enem chaven, and that's something that's potter on Shabbos. So we see that by chaylev, in a similar circumstance, it would be chayiv, but in Shabbos, in that same scenario, it would be potter. Prat l'misasik b'davar acher, but also b'yadim malachazu. If he was trying to pick something up and he ended up being toilish, there is no chiyuv Shabbos for such an act. Umiyu misasik v'ola b'yadoi achilas chalavim or yarayis, but by arayis and by chaylev chayiv shekfar nehena. So therefore, we have a good example of chaymer b'shar mitzvahs mi b'Shabbos. Now, why can't the shar mitzvahs be referring to avodah zarah? Avodah zarah lekal ukmi. You can't say it's speaking by avodah zarah and have a case of shagag v'loy mischaven, and we'll see soon why. So zok to Gemara, chaymer b'shar mitzvahs mi b'Shabbos. Why? Because sheb'shar mitzvahs shagag v'loy mischaven chayiv mashen kein b'Shabbos. So Omar Mar, let's get a better understanding of this price that we just quoted. Chomer b'Shabbos. Shabbos has a way where it's more chomer than other isurim. Shabbos asher shtayim, you get 2 karbanos, but other mitzvahs you would only bring 1 carbon. Hechadami. We need to find a case of Shabbos and a parallel case by other isurim to show this distinction. That by Shabbos you bring multiple chatois, but by the other aver you won't. So what would be the case? Ilema David ktsira utchina. On Shabbos, you did Ksir and Tchina, which are 2 separate malachas, hence 2 separate karbanas. What would be a similar case by Shar mitzvahs? The Kavasah gabe Shar mitzvahs, the Achal Chayla V'dam. For the Gemara, if you eat Chayla V'dam b'shoygig, avad you bring 2 karbanas chatos. Hachatarta mechayiv, v'hachatarta mechayiv. So what is the example where on Shabbos you bring 2 karbanas, yet other averis you wouldn't? Elo gabe Shar mitzvahs, the Ein Chayiv Ela Achas Heichadami. The achal chaylev v'chaylev. You ate 1 kezayis of chaylev, and then you ate a 2nd kezayis of chaylev. Well, Zek to Gemara, the kavasok b'Shabbos, David ksiru ksira. You did 2 ksiras. Well, again, we're back to square one. In this case, sai by Shabbos, you only chayiv 1 carbon, and sai by chaylev, you only chayiv 1 carbon. Behind you, the Amalei, Pak, Tana, Labra. That's why Rabbi Yochanan rejected the Brisa, because he says it simply doesn't make sense. You're making a distinction between how many chatois you would bring for Isser Shabbos versus an Isser of Chaylev. It's simply not true, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan rejected the Brisa of Reb Zakkai. Practically more my kusha. Why would Rabbi Yochanan have so easily dismissed the Brisa of Reb Zakkai? We can make a lot of sense out of it. Dilma la'olam eimalach, the Avad Ksir Utchina. The case of Shabbos that we're using as a comparison is 2 different malachos, and that's why you bring 2 different chatois. What's the parallel case by other averis where you only bring 1 chatos? Mashenke b'shar mitzvahs asan la'avoidis kachavim. That would apply to avoidis kachavim. Where do you see by avoidis zara where you do 2 violations and you only bring 1 carbon? Kid Rabami. It would go according to what Rabami said. The other Rabami zivech v'kita v'nisach b'helam echad ein chayv alachas. So here is a perfect example, according to Rav Ami, of a distinction between Shabbos, where you bring multiple chatois, versus by Avodah Zarah, where you only bring one chatos. Zogt Gemara, loy masuk melei b'avodas kachavim. You cannot say that the Shar mitzvahs that the Bryce is referring to is Avodah Zarah. Yes, it makes perfect sense when you're looking at the one chatos, which is the kula of Shar mitzvahs, and the multiple chatois, which is the chumrah of Shabbos. But the problem is, what are you going to do with the second case? The Katani Seifa, chaymer b'Shar mitzvahs. The Seifa is talking about a way where the Shar mitzvahs are chaymer. Now, if the Shar mitzvahs is speaking about Avodah Zarah, it will not make sense. Shebishar mitzvahs, shogag b'loy mischav and chayiv. That's not true. Shogag b'loy mischav and avodas kachavim hechidami. What is the case of shogag b'loy mischav by avodas kachavim, which would be a parallel case to Shabbos, where Shabbos is potter? That's not a mistake. That's not a shogeg, as we said many times. The same thing. So what is the case by Shabbat, by avodah zarah shogeg b'loy mischav? Ella, you're going to have to say, may I have a v'yira? So now we have another raya to Abaye. The may I have a v'yira is also considered like a shogeg. Ella, what are we going to have to say? The parallel case of shogeg b'loy mischav by avodah zarah is Ella by memuter ma'shein kei b'Shabbos the potter legamrei. That doesn't make sense, because at kan like boy minei Rav Nachman helam zelazeh helam zevazeh if you did both b'shogeg. Ella ilachayu v'chada ilachayu v'tarti. That was the whole shaila. If you chayiv one or two, but potter legamri lekalaman domar. Nobody's going to say it's potter legamri. Yet the Gemara, the Bryce over here says that by Shabbos of shogeg v'lo nischaven it's potter legamri. That's for sure not. So that can't be a case of Eimer Mutter. But by Eimer Mutter, there's a shaila if you chayiv one chatas two chatois. Our Bryce says Shabbos by shogeg v'lo nischaven is potter and ganzen. Zok my kusha. Why don't you say lema la'olam emalach reisha b'avodas kachavim? When the Brisa says that Shabbos is more chomer than avodas than Shar mitzvahs, that's referring to avodah zarah. And Seifa, where it says Shar mitzvahs is more chomer than Shabbos, it's not referring to avodah zarah. V'seifa b'Shar mitzvahs, such as chaylev, like we said. V'shogag v'loy mischaven the kasav roiku ubaloy ma'shein came b'Shabbos to potter. Shenischaven like beis a tolish v'chatas ha'mechuber potter. And it could go fit nicely. Uchad Rab Nachman or Shmuel. The Omar Hamasazik b'Chalav v'Arayis Chayiv Shekei Nehena. So by other mitzvahs where it's Nehena, Shagag b'loy mischaven is Chayiv. But Hamasazik b'Shabbos is Potter because Meleches Machsheves Osur Torah. So the question is, why did Rabbi Yochanan reject this Bryce of Reb Zakkai? We made perfect sense out of it. It fits in perfectly. Zok Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan l'taimei d'lei mukim asnisa reisha b'chat taimo v'seifa b'chat taimo. Rabbi Yochanan, when he learns Mishnayos, he never liked splitting up Mishnayos to say one, the reisha speaking in this case for this reason, and the seifa speaking in that case for that reason. He never liked to say that. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan refused to accept that when the Brisa says Shabbos is more chomer than Shar mitzvahs, the Shar mitzvahs refers to Avodah Zarah, and when the Brisa says Shar mitzvahs are more chomer than Shabbos, Shar mitzvahs is referring to chaylev. That is something that Rabbi Yochanan didn't want to accept, because he never accepted that. Because Rabbi Yochanan said, the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, man de metargim li chavis aliba de chatana moivilno monei basrei levei mesusa. If you can explain to me the Mishnah of chavis, that it should fit in with one tam, with one manda omar, then I will be very happy, and I will bring your begadim to the Beis HaMerchet, because I want to show that I respect you. What was the issue of chavis? Zok Rashi, there was a stira between the Reisha and the Seifa in Hamafkid. The Katani Osam, Hamafkid chavis etzel chaveroi. What if Reuven gave a chavis of wine to his friend to watch, but v'lo yichtu lo habai lamok? There was no designated space in the house of the Shomer, in Shimon's house, to place this barrel. And then Shimon unlawfully moved the barrel around. He wasn't allowed to. He was watching it for Reuven, had to leave it where it is. The tiltal of a nishpana broke. So the Mishnah says, if while he was holding it and moving it around, it broke, if he moved it around for his own purposes, not to benefit the barrel, he'll be chayiv. But if it benefits the barrel, meaning he wasn't, when he was moving it, he was never taking it. He was moving it, that was part of the service of the Shemira. If it breaks, then he's potter because he's not chayiv on gneva v'aveda. He's only chayiv on pshia. He's a shem mechina. But what if he finished handling it and he already put it down and then it broke afterwards? Then bein letzarcha potter. No matter why he moved the barrel, now that he's not touching it anymore, he's potter. That is the first half of the Mishnah. Now, the second half of the Mishnah says something that will not jive with the first half of the Mishnah. The second half of the Mishnah says, what if there was this designated space in the home of the shomer that this barrel was supposed to stay in? And then the tiltal of an ishbra, then we say, it doesn't matter, even if he put it back, the fact of the matter is, since he took it out of its designated space, if he moved the barrel for his own reasons, he's chayiv no matter what. But if he moved the barrel because the barrel needed to be moved, then it's going to be potter. Upar chasam, the Gemara had a steer over here in between the Reish and the Seif. Upar chasam, mani Rabbi Shmoli, the Amar loiba in das bailam, is it going according to Rabbi Shmuel, who holds that when you return something that you stole, or if you're a shomer and you took something unlawfully, like in our case, do you have to advise the bailam when you put it back? Or you can just put it back and it's considered returned. The Tanya we learned, Hagoin of Klamen Eider, V'Selam Nakis, Lamokim Shagon of Yachsadiv Rabbi Shmuel. All you have to do is put it back. You don't need to notify the bailam that you put it back. It's embarrassing. You can just put it back. But if you take something from somebody and you want to return it, you need to return it with das of the bailam. So let's say our Mishnah is following the sheet of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel, my irya lo yichtu, afilu yichtu nami. What's the difference between the ratio and the seifa? Say if it's lo yichtu makim, say if it's yichtu makim. Once you put it back, you're potter, because Rabbi Shmuel said you could put it back, and you're potter. So why would the Mishnah make a distinction between yichtu and lo yichtu? Zog to Gemara, you know what pshat in this price in the Mishnah is? Lo mi boy kamer. We're building up chedushim. Lo mi boy yichtu. It's pashut if you actually designated a specific place for the barrel. The mekaimai, where that's its right place. So there it's pashut that if you put it back in its right place, it's considered returned because you actually put it where it belonged. Elafidu lo yichtu. But even in a case where they were not miyached a place for this barrel, the lav mekaimai. So when you put it back, you're not really putting it back in its designated space because it doesn't have a designated space. Still loy boy das by Gewaltig. Seifa, so that would be the Reisha. The Reisha that's speaking by lo yichtu is saying, even in the case of lo yichtu, once you put it back, it's good. Seifa, that's speaking by yichtu, would go according to Rabbi Kiva. Frank Gemara, Rabbi Kiva, my ear yichtu. Rabbi Kiva holds that you need das bailam to give it back, and here there's no das bailam. So what's the difference if it's yichtu or not? My ear yichtu, afilu lo yichtu nami. So Gemara, no, the Seif is a chiddush in Rabbi Kiva. Let me buy kamar. Let me buy lo yichtu. It's pashut that if there's no specific place for it, you have to tell a bailam when you give it back because you're not really putting it back into its designated space. The lav mekaimihi. Elafilu yichtu nami. The mekaimihi bo'inin das bailam. So come to Reish, the way the Gemara ended up learning the Mishnah is that the ratio was going according to Rabbi Shmuel, the Sefer Rabbi Kiva. But Rabbi Yochanan didn't like that. And if you want to say that maybe it's all going according to Rabbi Shmuel, but the shaila is where you put it back, and the ratio is speaking where you put it back in the right place. Which some Amiroyim there in Bava Metzia explain the Mishnah that way. Have a matzah look like Rabbi Shmuel. You could have said that the whole Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Shmuel. But the problem is now you have to say that the ratio is speaking where you put it back in the wrong place. You put it back in the wrong place. So the ratio is speaking where you put it back in the right place, and the safe is when you put it back in the wrong place. It's also a difference. If someone could learn for me the Mishnah that we just learned, that would make it consistent with one Tana and with one case, I will carry his begotten to the Beis HaMerchos. So you see, Rabbi Yochanan never liked splitting up Mishnayos, and that's why he rejected the brisa that Reb Zakkai quoted, because he couldn't tolerate that the ratio of our brisa should be talking about Zora when it says Shar Mitzvahs, and the Sefer of our brisa should be speaking about Chelev when we're talking about Shar Mitzvahs. Okay, Gavaltak, we'll stop here, and we'll be Mamshech tomorrow.